Here's she was courting his best friend. The Duke watched, then said, "He'll never value you the way you deserve. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us from. And subscribe if you love romantic stories like this. Now let's fall into this tale together." The spring of 1874 arrived in London with an oppressive warmth that seemed to mock Lady Scarlett Thompson's increasingly desperate situation. At the age of 23, Scarlett had long since accepted her place in the intricate hierarchy of London society, eternally pleasant, perpetually overlooked, and far too practical to harbour romantic delusions. Her father, Viscount Thompson, possessed an old title and a dwindling fortune, enough to secure invitations to every notable event, but not quite enough to make his only daughter a desirable match. 3 seasons had come and gone, each one leaving Scarlett more invisible than the last, until she'd become what every young lady feared most, a confirmed wallflower with rapidly diminishing prospects. Another season, another exercise in futility, Scarlett murmured to herself as her lady's maid, Molly, fastened the last button on her pale blue morning dress. The colour washed her out. She knew this, but at this point, fashion seemed an extravagance for someone who'd already been written off by society's marriage market. "Now, Miss Scarlett, that's no way to talk," Molly chided gently, though her eyes held sympathy. The servants knew. Everyone knew. The Thompson household lived on borrowed time and borrowed credit, and Scarlett's marriage, to anyone with adequate funds, had become less a hope and more a necessity. The summons to her father's study came at precisely 10 o'clock, which told Scarlett everything she needed to know. Her father only operated on such punctuality when discussing matters of grave importance or profound unpleasantness, usually both. Viscount Thompson sat behind his mahogany desk, looking every one of his 58 years. His face, once handsome, had settled into lines of perpetual worry, deepened by years of poor investments and poorer luck. "Scarlett, sit down." His tone was gentle but firm, the voice of a man about to deliver news he knew she wouldn't welcome. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, with practiced composure. "Yes, father? I've had a conversation with the Earl of Kingsley, about his son Adrian." He paused, watching her face carefully. "Lord Adrian Kingsley has expressed interest in courting you, formally, with the intention of marriage." Scarlett's stomach dropped. She knew Adrian Kingsley, knew him the way one knows an unpleasant fact that cannot be ignored. He was 28, moderately handsome in a cold sort of way, possessed of a considerable fortune, and absolutely insufferable in temperament. "Father, before you protest," he interrupted, his voice taking on a desperate edge she'd never heard before, "you need to understand our situation. The estate is mortgaged beyond redemption. Our creditors are losing patience. Your dowry, such as it is, has already been spent." He looked away, shame colouring his features. "Without an advantageous marriage, we will lose everything. The house in London, the estate in the country, everything your mother loved." The mention of her late mother, dead these 5 years, was a calculated blow, and they both knew it. "And Lord Adrian knows about our circumstances?" Scarlett asked quietly. "He does. He's looking for a wife of good breeding and pleasant temperament. You fit his requirements, and his fortune would solve all our immediate problems." Her father leaned forward, his expression pleading. "I'm not asking you to love him, Scarlett. I'm asking you to save this family." The weight of 3 generations of Thompsons settled onto Scarlett's shoulders. She thought of the servants who depended on their wages, of the tenants on their struggling estate, of her father's health that deteriorated with each new financial crisis. "Very well," she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll accept Lord Adrian's courtship." The relief on her father's face was almost painful to witness. The courtship began with all the romantic enthusiasm of a business transaction, which, Scarlett supposed, was exactly what it was. Lord Adrian Kingsley called on her the following afternoon, arriving with the punctuality of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a woman he desired. He was tall, with fair hair that fell artfully across his forehead, pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue rather than appreciate, and a smile that never quite reached those calculating eyes. "Lady Scarlett," he said, bowing with perfect technical precision but no warmth, "how kind of you to receive me." "Lord Adrian," she curtsied, already feeling the weight of the performance they were both about to give. They sat in the drawing-room under the watchful eye of Aunt Agnes, Scarlett's maternal aunt who'd come to serve as chaperone. Agnes was a widow of 45 with a surprisingly progressive view of marriage. For a woman of her generation, she believed in honesty, if not necessarily in romance. "Well," Adrian said, settling into his chair with the air of a man at a business meeting, "I suppose we should establish the parameters of this arrangement." Scarlett blinked. "I beg your pardon. This courtship, let's not pretend it's based on passionate affection. You need financial security. I need a wife of appropriate breeding who won't cause scandal or demand excessive emotional investment. We're both practical people. Why not be honest about it?" His bluntness was almost refreshing, if also deeply insulting. "How very pragmatic of you," Scarlett managed, not bothering to hide the edge in her voice. "Pragmatism is undervalued in matters of marriage," Adrian continued, apparently oblivious to her tone, or choosing to ignore it. "Passion fades. Romance is a fiction perpetuated by poets who've never had to manage an estate or maintain a social position. What remains is compatibility of purpose and absence of drama. And you believe we possess this compatibility?" Scarlett asked, already knowing they possessed nothing of the sort. "Sayaka and I believe we possess mutual need, which is far more reliable." He studied her with those cool blue eyes. "You're pleasant enough to look at, well-bred, and most importantly, you understand your position. You won't harbor foolish expectations of love or demand constant attention. That suits me perfectly." Aunt Agnes made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or a gasp of outrage. Scarlett couldn't tell which. "How flattering," Scarlett said, her voice sweet enough to disguise the sarcasm barely. "And what are your expectations for a wife, Lord Adrian? Beyond emotional unavailability and accepting neglect with grace?" Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, that she had a spine after all. "I expect discretion, proper management of household affairs, and the production of an heir. In return, you'll have financial security, social position, and the freedom to pursue whatever genteel hobbies occupy ladies of your station." "What an inspiring vision of matrimony!" "It's an honest one." Adrian leaned back, apparently satisfied with the exchange. "I have no patience for the games other couples play, the pretense of affection, the exhausting performance of devotion. We'll be civil to each other in public, cordial in private, and otherwise maintain separate spheres. It's a perfectly reasonable arrangement." Scarlett felt something inside her shrivel. Was this truly what her life had come to? A marriage of cold civility to a man who viewed her as a necessary inconvenience. But then she thought of her father's desperate eyes, of the servants who would lose their positions, of the estate that would be sold to strangers. What choice did she have? "I suppose we should begin appearing together publicly," she said, the words tasting like ash, "to establish the courtship properly." "Agreed. The Ashford ball is in 3 days. I'll escort you." He stood, signaling the end of the interview. "I'll call on you twice a week, take you for drives in the park, and ensure we're seen together at all major social events. By the end of the season, we'll announce our engagement." After he left, Aunt Agnes moved to sit beside Scarlett on the settee. "Well," Agnes said dryly, "he's certainly direct." "He's horrible," Scarlett whispered, her composure finally cracking. "He's cold and arrogant, and he sees me as nothing more than a broodmare with acceptable bloodlines." "Yes," Agnes agreed, "but he's also wealthy and willing. And darling, unless you have a better option, horrible might be the best you can manage." The brutal honesty hurt more than false comfort would have. The Ashford ball was exactly as tedious as Scarlett had expected, with the added misery of being escorted by a man who treated the evening as an obligation to be endured, rather than an opportunity to enjoy. Adrian had called for her precisely at 9, commented on her appearance with all the enthusiasm of someone noting the weather. "That shade of gold suits your coloring adequately," and spent the carriage ride discussing his expectations for how she should conduct herself at social events. "Nothing too animated," he instructed. "Excessive enthusiasm is vulgar. Laugh quietly at appropriate moments. But don't draw unnecessary attention. And please don't engage in gossip. It's beneath someone of your station." Scarlett bit back approximately 17 sharp retorts and simply nodded. The Ashford ballroom glittered with the usual opulence. Hundreds of candles, fresh flowers despite the early season, and enough jewels on display to fund a small country. Scarlett had attended dozens of such events over her 3 seasons, always as an observer rather than a participant in the great theatre of courtship. Tonight was different, only in that she had an escort, though Adrian's attention to her was minimal at best. He introduced her to his friends with the same enthusiasm one might introduce a piece of furniture recently acquired at auction. Lady Scarlett Thompson, my companion for the evening. Not his interest, not his particular friend, his companion. As though she were a hired escort rather than the woman he intended to marry. They danced once, a perfunctory waltz during which Adrian held her at maximum acceptable distance and discussed crop rotation on his estate in Kent. Scarlett spent the 3 minutes of the dance fantasizing about accidentally stepping on his foot. Hard. You're quite light on your feet, Adrian observed as the music ended. That's fortunate. I despise clumsy dancers. How lovely to meet your exacting standards, Scarlett replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He either missed or ignored her tone. I'm going to speak with Worthington about a horse he's selling. You should mingle, I suppose. Try to look pleasant. And then he simply walked away, leaving her standing at the edge of the dance floor like an abandoned parasol. Scarlett found refuge near the refreshment table, her usual station, and tried not to calculate how many more evenings like this she would have to endure. Dozens, hundreds, the rest of her life. Scarlett, there you are. Lady Beatrice Thornton materialized beside her, beautiful and vivacious in emerald silk that made her auburn hair gleam like fire. Beatrice was one of the few young women who still acknowledged Scarlett's existence after multiple unsuccessful seasons, partly out of genuine kindness, partly because Beatrice was secure enough in her own social position to not see Scarlett as competition. Beatrice, Scarlett greeted her with the first genuine smile of the evening. You look stunning. Don't I always? Beatrice laughed, then her expression turned curious. I saw you arrive with Lord Adrian Kingsley. Are congratulations in order? Condolences would be more appropriate, Scarlett muttered before she could stop herself. Beatrice's eyes widened. That bad? He spent our dance discussing agricultural practices and told me I was adequately light-footed. Good heavens. Beatrice looped her arm through Scarlett's. Well, he's rich at least. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, apparently, including the freedom to be insufferably boring while doing it. The price of financial security. Beatrice squeezed her arm sympathetically. Then her expression shifted to something more animated. Oh, speaking of eligible gentlemen, have you heard? George Brandon is back in London. Scarlett's breath caught. George Brandon. The Duke of Brandon. Adrian's best friend from their days at Eton and Oxford. She'd met the Duke exactly twice in as many years. Once at a garden party where he'd been polite but distant, and once at a musicale where they'd exchanged perhaps 5 words. He'd been striking rather than conventionally handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that refused to stay properly tamed, and the most extraordinary eyes, green with flecks of gold, like sunlight through forest leaves. But more than his appearance, she remembered his intensity, the way he'd looked at her during that musical, really looked at her, as though she were a puzzle he wanted to solve, rather than a decorative object to be catalogued and dismissed. Then he'd left on an extended journey. India, someone had said, for business and perhaps to escape some unnamed scandal, and Scarlett had relegated him to the category of interesting but irrelevant encounters. He's been gone over a year, Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. No one knows exactly why he left so suddenly. Some say it was a woman. Others claim it was financial troubles with his estates in the north. But regardless, he's back now and looking rather different. Different how? Darker. More serious, if that's possible. George was always intense, but now there's something almost dangerous about him, like he's seen things that changed him. Beatrice fanned herself dramatically. It's rather attractive, actually. Half the mamas in London have already marked him as prime quarry for their daughters. Scarlett felt an unexpected pang of something she didn't want to examine too closely. I'm sure the Duke will handle their attentions with his usual efficiency. Oh, he won't be handling anything. He's apparently sworn off marriage entirely. Says he has no patience for society's expectations or the marriage market's machinations. Beatrice grinned wickedly. Which, of course, only makes him more desirable. Nothing attracts ambitious mamas like a wealthy duke who claims he won't marry. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden shift in the ballroom's energy, that peculiar ripple of attention that occurred when someone truly notable made an entrance. Scarlett turned toward the doorway and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. George Brandon stood at the entrance to the ballroom, and Beatrice hadn't been exaggerating. He looked different. His dark hair was longer than fashion strictly dictated, curling slightly at his collar. His evening clothes fit him perfectly, but he wore them with a carelessness that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His face had always been striking, but now there was a hardness to his features that hadn't been there before, jaw more defined, a small scar near his left eyebrow, and an expression that suggested he was mentally calculating the fastest route of escape. But it was his eyes that captured Scarlett's attention. Those green-gold eyes swept the ballroom with barely concealed impatience, cataloguing and dismissing the assembled company with ruthless efficiency, until they found hers. The impact was physical. Scarlett's breath caught, her pulse spiking as George Brandon's eyes locked onto hers across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something passed between them. Awareness, perhaps, or unexpected interest. Whatever it was made her heart race in a way she didn't want to examine. Then his gaze moved past her, the moment broken, and he was scanning the crowd again. "Did you see that?" Beatrice hissed. "He looked right at you." "He was looking past me," Scarlett corrected, trying to calm her traitorous pulse. "Looking for Adrian, most likely. They're friends." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. George Brandon had looked at her, really looked at her, and something in that look had awakened a dangerous hope she had no right to feel. Adrian materialized at her elbow with terrible timing. "There's Brandon. I should greet him. Come along." It wasn't a request. Adrian took her arm with the possessive confidence of a man staking his claim and steered her through the crowd toward his friend. George Brandon watched their approach with an expression Scarlett couldn't quite decipher. His eyes moved from Adrian's face to where Adrian's hand gripped her arm, and something flickered across his features. Disapproval, concern. "Brandon." Adrian's voice carried the hearty, false warmth of old friendship tinged with competition. "Heard you'd skulked back into town. Thought you'd sworn off London society." "I had." George's voice was deeper than Scarlett remembered, roughened perhaps by whatever experiences he'd had abroad. "Unfortunately, my mother has strong opinions about family obligation. And what the Duchess wants, the Duchess generally achieves." His eyes moved to Scarlett, and she felt that jolt again, electricity and recognition, and something she couldn't name. "Lady Scarlett Thompson," Adrian said with the bare minimum of proper introduction. The lady I'm currently courting, Lady Scarlett, His Grace the Duke of Brandon, old friend from my Eton days." The introduction was perfunctory and borderline insulting, reducing Scarlett to an accessory of Adrian's social life rather than a person in her own right. George's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He bowed with a grace that made Adrian's earlier bow seem mechanical by comparison. "Lady Scarlett." His voice, when he addressed her directly, was careful, controlled. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance properly. We've met before, I believe. The Hartwell musical last year," he remembered. Across 12 months and countless social events, George Brandon remembered a 5-word exchange at a musical. "Your Grace." Scarlett curtsied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the way her pulse hammered. "Yes, at the musical. You were kind enough to compliment the performance, though I suspect you were being more gracious than honest." Something that might have been humor flickered in his eyes. "I never say things I don't mean, Lady Scarlett. If I complimented the performance, I meant it." "George is pathologically honest," Adrian interjected, with a laugh that sounded forced. "It's one of his more irritating qualities. Can't simply be polite like civilized people." "Honesty and politeness aren't mutually exclusive," George replied, his eyes never leaving Scarlett's face. "Though I grant that London society often treats them as such." There was something in his gaze, a question, perhaps, or a challenge. Scarlett had the strangest sensation that George Brandon was seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way that Adrian never had and never would. "How was your journey?" Adrian asked, apparently oblivious to the tension crackling between his friend and the woman he was courting. "Mother said you were in India. Business with the estates, among other things." George finally looked away from Scarlett, breaking the connection. The change of scenery was necessary. Running from something or running toward something. Adrian's tone was light, but there was an edge beneath it. "For you left rather abruptly, if I recall." "Sometimes abrupt departures are the only kind that matter." George's expression had shuttered into careful neutrality, but Scarlett caught something underneath. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "But I'm back now, and Mother has assured me that if I attempt to leave again before the season ends, she'll find creative ways to make me regret it." "The Duchess is formidable," Adrian agreed. "Well, you'll have to dine with us soon. Catch up properly. I'm courting Lady Scarlett here. Plan to announce an engagement by season's end. should make it official and all that. He delivered this news with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a moderately successful business venture. George's eyes moved back to Scarlett, and this time what she saw in them was unmistakable, something between sympathy and horror, quickly suppressed. "Congratulations," he said quietly, the words sounding like condolence. "Lady Scarlett, I hope you'll be very happy." The pause before a happy was so slight that perhaps only Scarlett noticed it, or perhaps Adrian noticed and simply didn't care. "I'm sure we'll be perfectly satisfied with the arrangement," Scarlett heard herself say, and hated how her voice sounded. Resigned, defeated. George's jaw clenched again, that muscle jumping beneath his skin. Satisfaction is certainly something. "Better than those foolish romantic notions that cause nothing but trouble," Adrian said blithely. "Scarlett and I understand each other perfectly. It's quite practical." "Practical," George repeated the word, as though tasting something bitter. "Yes, how very so practical." The conversation was rescued from further awkwardness by the arrival of Lady Penelope Ashford, their hostess, who swept George away to meet her daughter, a beautiful 18-year-old debutante who gazed at the Duke with stars in her eyes. Adrian watched them go with satisfaction. Good. Maybe Brandon will finally settle down. He needs a wife who'll give him an heir and stop his mother from harassing him. A young Penelope would be perfect, bideable, beautiful, and most importantly, undemanding. Scarlett felt something twist in her chest, watching George be introduced to the girl who was everything London society valued. Young, fresh, uncomplicated. "Shall we dance again?" Adrian asked, already moving toward the dance floor without waiting for her answer. Scarlett followed mechanically, but as they took their positions for the quadrille, her eyes found George Brandon across the ballroom. He was listening to Lady Penelope with polite attention, but his gaze kept drifting, finding Scarlett, holding for a heartbeat, then pulling away as though the contact burned. 3 times during the dance, their eyes met across the crowded floor. 3 times, Scarlett felt that same jolt of recognition, of connection, of something that had no place in the practical arrangement she'd agreed to. And 3 times, she reminded herself that George Brandon was Adrian's best friend, that she was promised to Adrian in all but formal announcement, and that whatever she thought she saw in the Duke's green-gold eyes was nothing more than fantasy. The last desperate hope of a wallflower who'd finally accepted that romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. But when the dance ended and Adrian immediately abandoned her to discuss hunting with his friends, Scarlett found herself standing near the terrace doors, trying to catch her breath and calm her racing heart. Lady Scarlett. She turned to find George Brandon standing closer than propriety strictly allowed, his expression intense and troubled. "Your Grace," she managed. "Did you need something?" He stopped, seeming to struggle with whatever he wanted to say. "Forgive me, this is presumptuous, but are you certain about this courtship with Adrian? He's my oldest friend, and I value his friendship. But, Scarlett prompted when he trailed off. George's hands clenched at his sides. "He's not. Adrian doesn't understand that women are people rather than acquisitions. He'll never value you the way you deserve to be valued." The words hung between them, dangerous and thrilling, and completely inappropriate. "And how do I deserve to be valued, Your Grace?" Scarlett asked softly, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. George's eyes held hers, and in them she saw a hunger that matched her own. "Like you matter, like your thoughts and feelings and desires are worth consideration, like you're more than a solution to someone else's problem." Scarlett couldn't breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, as though she were a complete person rather than a decorative object or financial asset. "That's a lovely sentiment," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But sentiment doesn't pay debts or save estates. Sometimes practicality must outweigh desire, even when practicality means a lifetime of unhappiness. Better unhappy than destitute." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "Not all of us have the luxury of waiting for perfection, Your Grace." George flinched as though she'd struck him. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Scarlett softened her tone, seeing the genuine concern in his face. "And I appreciate it, truly. But my situation is what it is. Adrian may not be ideal, but he's willing, and that makes him more than I had any right to expect." "You deserve so much more than willingness," George said quietly, his voice rough with conviction. "You deserve better than someone who sees you as a convenient solution. Adrian is my friend, but he's treating this like a business transaction, and you're—" He stopped himself, seeming to realize he'd already said too much. You deserve to be more than that. More than what? Scarlett asked, her voice barely above a whisper. George's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. More than an afterthought. The words pierced something in Scarlett's chest, painful and sweet all at once. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself imagine what it might be like to be truly known by someone, rather than merely tolerated. Then reality reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. I should return to Adrian, she said, taking a step back from George and the dangerous hope he represented. Thank you for your concern, Your Grace, but please, don't trouble yourself further. I've made my choice. She walked away before he could respond, before she could do something foolish like cry or beg, or admit that after one conversation, George Brandon had made her feel more alive than Adrian had in weeks of dutiful courtship. Behind her, she felt the weight of his gaze following her across the ballroom, and she knew with a certainty that terrified her that something had irrevocably changed. The careful, practical arrangement she'd agreed to had just become infinitely more complicated. Because how was she supposed to marry Adrian Kingsley when George Brandon looked at her like she mattered? The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical conversation. Adrian reclaimed her for another dance, discussing his plans for modernizing his Kent estate with all the passion most men reserved for their lovers. Scarlett nodded at appropriate intervals, contributed meaningless pleasantries, and tried desperately not to search the ballroom for a tall figure with dark hair and green-gold eyes. She failed. Every time she caught sight of George, he was watching her. Not obviously, he was too controlled for that, but she felt it. The weight of his attention, the intensity of his focus, as though she were the only person in the room who mattered to him. It was probably her imagination, desperation playing tricks on her mind. A wallflower starved for genuine attention, seeing romance where there was only polite concern from a man worried his friend was making a poor match. That had to be it. The alternative, that George Brandon actually saw her, wanted her, felt something real, was too dangerous to consider. When her father's carriage finally arrived to take her and Aunt Agnes home, Scarlett felt like she'd survived a battle. She sagged against the velvet seat, exhaustion overwhelming her. Well, Aunt Agnes said carefully. That was eventful. Was it? Scarlett kept her eyes closed, unwilling to see her aunt's too perceptive gaze. Percy, the Duke of Brandon, barely took his eyes off you all evening, and when he spoke to you near the terrace, half the ballroom noticed. He's concerned about his friend making a suitable match. Is that what you think? Agnes's voice was gentle. Darling, that man looked at you like you were the answer to every question he's ever asked. You're being dramatic, and you're being willfully blind. Agnes reached over and squeezed Scarlett's hand. But I suppose that's easier than facing what's actually happening. Scarlett didn't respond, because what could she say? That she'd felt it too. That for one impossible conversation, she'd felt seen in a way she'd never experienced. That George Brandon had awakened something in her that Adrian never had and never would. What good would admitting any of that do? She was promised to Adrian, not officially, not yet, but the understanding was there. The courtship was established. Society expected an engagement announcement by season's end. Her feelings, whatever they were, didn't matter. They couldn't matter. The following days settled into a rhythm that was both tedious and torturous. Adrian called every other afternoon, his visits lasting precisely 45 minutes. Not a moment more, not a moment less. He brought flowers once, chosen by his secretary rather than himself, and presented them with all the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling a contractual obligation. Mother says flowers are expected, he'd explained. And I told her you weren't sentimental, but she insisted on maintaining proper form. Scarlett had thanked him and handed the bouquet to Molly, trying not to remember that George Brandon had once complimented her piano playing from a performance a year ago. Remembering details Adrian couldn't be bothered to notice about her current existence. They took drives in Hyde Park, where Adrian nodded to acquaintances and discussed investments, while Scarlett smiled vapidly and wondered if this was truly what the rest of her life would be like. In the evenings, there were balls and musicales and dinner parties, endless social obligations where Scarlett performed her role as Adrian's almost fiancé with practiced efficiency. And at every single event, George Brandon was there, not approaching, not speaking beyond bare pleasantries when social necessity demanded it, but present, watching. His eyes finding hers across crowded rooms with an intensity that made her breath catch and her heart race. After 3 weeks, the invitation to dine at the Kingsley residence arrived exactly when Adrian had predicted it would. Mother insists on a proper dinner, Adrian had explained with his usual lack of enthusiasm. Small gathering, just family and close friends. Brandon will be there, of course. She's determined to integrate you into our social circle before we make the engagement official. The words, "make the engagement official," had sent a cold shiver down Scarlett's spine, but she'd merely nodded and accepted. Now, standing in her dressing room while Molly arranged her hair, Scarlett tried to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. She told herself it was anxiety about meeting Adrian's formidable mother, the Countess of Kingsley, known throughout London for her exacting standards and sharp tongue. It had nothing to do with seeing George Brandon again, nothing whatsoever. The deep rose silk, Miss Scarlett? Molly held up the gown, one of Scarlett's few remaining dresses that hadn't been altered multiple times to keep up with changing fashions. Or, yes, that will do. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit. The color brought warmth to her pale complexion and made her blue eyes seem brighter. The neckline was modest but flattering, and the cut emphasized her figure without being improper. Why did she care how she looked? Adrian certainly wouldn't notice. He'd made his aesthetic assessment of her weeks ago. Adequate. But George Brandon had looked at her with eyes that actually saw her, and some traitorous part of Scarlett wanted him to look at her like that again. The Kingsley townhouse was everything Scarlett expected. Imposing, elegant, and slightly cold, much like Adrian himself. A liveried footman escorted her and Aunt Agnes through marble halls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Kingsley ancestors who seemed to judge her with their painted eyes. "Relax, darling," Agnes whispered. "You look lovely, and you've done nothing wrong." But Scarlett felt like she'd done everything wrong simply by existing in a situation she hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. The drawing room was already occupied when they entered. Adrian stood by the fireplace with his mother, a handsome woman of 50 with silver-streaked blonde hair and Adrian's same pale blue eyes. They were conversing with someone Scarlett couldn't see. His back turned to the door. Then he turned, and Scarlett's breath caught. George Brandon wore evening clothes with the same careless perfection she remembered, his dark hair slightly disheveled as though he'd been running his hands through it. But it was his expression when he saw her that made her heart stutter. A flash of something intense and quickly suppressed, replaced by careful neutrality. "Lady Scarlett, Lady Agnes," Adrian said with perfunctory politeness. "Allow me to present my mother, the Countess of Kingsley." Mother? Lady Scarlett Thompson and her aunt, Lady Agnes Pemberton. The Countess's assessment was swift and thorough, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of Scarlett's appearance, deportment, and worth. Scarlett had been evaluated by ambitious mothers for 3 seasons. She recognized the calculation immediately. "Lady Scarlett?" The Countess's tone was cool but not unkind. "Adrian has spoken of you. I understand your father is Viscount Thompson. Old family, I believe." "Yes, your ladyship. The title dates back to the Tudor period." And I understand there are some financial difficulties." The bluntness was startling. Scarlett felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "My father has experienced some reversals, yes. He's been quite honest about our circumstances." "Good. I despise deception in these matters." The Countess's expression softened infinitesimally. "Adrian needs a wife of good breeding who understands the value of discretion. Your situation makes you practical. I appreciate practicality. It should have felt like approval. Instead, it felt like being priced and found barely acceptable. You remember Brandon, of course," Adrian said, gesturing toward George as though he were a piece of furniture. "He's dining with us this evening." George bowed, his movements controlled and precise. "Lady Scarlett, Lady Agnes, a pleasure to see you both again." His voice was carefully polite, but when his eyes met Scarlett's, she saw that same intensity from the ball, quickly banked but undeniably present. "Your Grace," Scarlett managed, grateful her voice didn't shake. "How kind of you to join us." "The Kingsleys are like family," George said, though something in his tone suggested the comparison wasn't entirely comfortable. "I've been dining here since Adrian and I were boys at Eton. Brandon is practically another son," the Countess said with genuine warmth, the first real emotion Scarlett had seen from her, just though infinitely better behaved than my actual son ever was. "Only because I lacked Adrian's creative imagination for trouble," George replied, and something almost like humor flickered in his expression. The butler announced dinner, and they processed to the dining room with the rigid formality that characterized aristocratic gatherings. Scarlett found herself seated across from George, with Adrian to her right and the Countess at the head of the table. It was going to be a very long evening. The first course was consumed with polite conversation about weather, society gossip, and the upcoming season's notable events. Scarlett contributed when addressed, laughed quietly at appropriate moments, and generally performed the role of agreeable future daughter-in-law with practiced ease. But she was acutely, painfully aware of George Brandon sitting across from her. He ate with the same controlled precision he seemed to bring to everything, each movement deliberate, nothing wasted. He participated in the conversation with intelligence and occasional dry wit that made the Countess laugh and even drew reluctant smiles from Adrian, and every few minutes his eyes would find Scarlett's across the table, holding for just a heartbeat too long before looking away. "Lady Scarlett," the Countess said as the second course arrived, "Adrian tells me you're accomplished at the pianoforte. I play adequately, your ladyship. I wouldn't claim true accomplishment. False modesty is as tiresome as false pride," George said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. He met Scarlett's eyes directly. "I heard you play at the Hartwell musical last year. You were more than adequate. You were genuinely talented." Scarlett's heart hammered. He'd not only remembered their brief meeting, he'd actually listened to her play. "Brandon has excellent taste in music," the Countess observed. "If he says you play well, you play well. He's brutally honest about such things." "Honesty is undervalued," George said, still looking at Scarlett. "Too many people confuse politeness with kindness, when sometimes the kindest thing is to tell the truth." "And what truth would that be?" Adrian asked with a laugh that held an edge. "That my future wife plays the pianoforte well. Hardly revolutionary. That talent should be acknowledged rather than diminished," George replied evenly. Especially when the talented person is inclined to diminish themselves." The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with music. "How philosophical," Adrian said dryly. "You've come back from India quite the poet he's Brandon. All that Eastern mysticism affecting your practical English sensibilities." "India taught me that there are different ways of seeing the world," George said, his tone carefully neutral. "Not all of them involve reducing everything to transactions and acquisitions." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Meaning that some things, some people, have value beyond their utility." George's jaw tightened. "But I'm sure you know that already." The tension at the table was suddenly palpable. The Countess looked between her son and his friend with shrewd eyes, while Aunt Agnes studied her wineglass with great interest. Scarlett felt like she was watching something unfold that she didn't fully understand, some confrontation between George and Adrian that had nothing to do with philosophy or India, and everything to do with her. "Brandon has always been sentimental," Adrian said with forced lightness. "It's his one weakness, gets attached to causes and ideas that practical men have already dismissed as unworkable." "Better sentimental than cynical," George replied quietly. "Cynicism makes you miss what actually matters, and sentimentality makes you waste time on what never will." They stared at each other across the table, some silent battle of wills playing out that left Scarlett feeling like a prize being fought over without anyone actually asking her opinion. "Gentlemen," the Countess said crisply, breaking the tension, "perhaps we might discuss something less abstract. Lady Scarlett, tell me about your family's estate in... where is it?" "Kent, Suffolk, your ladyship, Thornbury Manor. It's been in my mother's family for generations, and in some disrepair. I understand." The Countess's bluntness was starting to feel less like honesty and more like calculated cruelty. "The estate has challenges," Scarlett admitted, hating the heat in her cheeks. "My father has done his best, but he needs Adrian's money to save it," the Countess finished. "Yes," Adrian explained. "It's a sensible arrangement. You bring breeding and connections. Adrian brings financial security. Everyone benefits." "How romantic," George muttered, so quietly that perhaps only Scarlett heard him. She looked at him sharply and found his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his knife and fork with barely restrained tension. "Romance is a luxury for people who can afford it," Adrian said, apparently having heard George's comment after all. "Scarlett and I are being realistic. We're well-suited, compatible temperaments, aligned goals, no messy emotional entanglements to complicate things." "You make it sound like a business merger," George said, his voice tight. "Isn't it?" Adrian shrugged. "Marriage among our class has always been about alliances and property. At least Scarlett and I are honest about it." "Honest?" George repeated the word, like it tasted bitter. "Yes, I suppose honesty is something." Scarlett wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole, Being discussed like a commodity was humiliating enough in private. Having it done in front of George Brandon, who looked at her like she mattered, was almost unbearable. "I think," she said quietly, surprising herself with her own boldness, "that honesty and compatibility are valuable foundations for any partnership. Romance is unpredictable, unreliable. Better to build on something more solid." The words hurt to say, but they were practical. True, even. George's eyes found hers, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not disappointment, exactly. Something deeper. Sadness, perhaps. Or recognition of a kindred soul trapped by circumstances. "Quite right," the Countess said approvingly. "You're a sensible girl, Lady Scarlet. That's refreshing. Too many young women these days have their heads filled with nonsense from novels." The conversation moved on to other topics. Politics, estate management, society gossip, but Scarlet barely heard any of it. She was too aware of George, sitting across from her in controlled silence, his eyes occasionally finding hers with that same intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. When dinner finally ended, and the ladies withdrew to leave the gentlemen to their port, Scarlet felt like she'd survived a battle. "Well," Aunt Agnes murmured as they settled in the drawing room, "that was illuminating." "Was it?" Scarlet asked tiredly. "The Duke of Brandon is in love with you." Scarlet nearly dropped her teacup. "What?" "No, he barely took his eyes off you all evening. And when Adrian spoke about your courtship, Brandon looked like he wanted to overturn the table." Agnes's expression was sympathetic. "Poor man. He's trying very hard to be honorable." "You're imagining things," Scarlet insisted, even as her heart raced at the possibility. "George, His Grace, is Adrian's friend. He's concerned about Adrian making a suitable match, that's all." "If you believe that, darling, you're more naive than I thought." Before Scarlet could respond, the gentleman rejoined them. George moved immediately to the window, putting maximum distance between himself and the rest of the party. Adrian settled beside Scarlet with proprietary confidence, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be affectionate but felt merely possessive. "Brandon's in a mood," Adrian said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I think India disagrees with him. He's come back all brooding and intense. Quite tiresome, really." "Perhaps I simply developed different priorities," George said from his position by the window. His back was to the room, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Different priorities." Adrian laughed. "What? Rejecting practical reasoning in favor of romantic idealism? That's unlike you, old friend. Maybe I learned that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting is impractical." George turned to face them, and the expression on his face made Scarlet's breath catch. "Maybe I learned that honor sometimes means standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." The words hung in the air, laden with meaning that everyone felt but no one acknowledged directly. "How very noble," Adrian said dryly. "And what precisely are you fighting for?" George's eyes found Scarlet's across the room. For one heartbeat, two, they simply looked at each other, and Scarlet saw everything Aunt Agnes had claimed. The longing, the frustration, the desperate, barely restrained desire to say something that couldn't be said. Then George looked away. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Nothing at all. Forgive me, I'm tired. The evening has been more difficult than I anticipated." He made his excuses and left shortly after, bowing to the ladies and clasping Adrian's shoulder with what looked like genuine affection mixed with something darker. As the door closed behind him, Scarlet felt like something vital had been torn away. The pattern established itself over the following days with painful predictability. Adrian would call on Scarlet. They would have strained conversations about nothing of importance, and he would occasionally mention seeing George, always with a slight edge to his voice that suggested he knew something but couldn't quite name it. And everywhere Scarlet went, balls, garden parties, musicales, George Brandon was there, not approaching, not speaking to her beyond the bare minimum of polite acknowledgement, but present, watching, his green-gold eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin warm and her heart race. It was maddening. It was intoxicating. It was completely inappropriate. Lady Beatrice noticed. Of course, at the Thornbury garden party, she'd pulled Scarlet aside with gleeful curiosity. "The Duke of Brandon is staring at you again. He's been doing it for the past 20 minutes. Adrian hasn't noticed because he's too busy discussing horse breeding with Lord Worthington, but everyone else has." "I'm sure you're exaggerating," Scarlet said weakly. "I'm really not." "And Scarlet," Beatrice's expression turned serious. "People are starting to talk. Not maliciously, not yet, but they're noticing. You need to be careful. I'm not doing anything wrong. I know, but in society, perception matters more than truth. And the perception is that the Duke of Brandon can't stop looking at you like you're water, and he's dying of thirst. The word sent a thrill through Scarlett that she immediately tried to suppress. That evening, at yet another ball, the Wentworth affair, the situation came to a head. Scarlett was standing near the terrace doors, taking a brief respite from Adrian's company. He'd abandoned her, as usual, to speak with his friends about investments, leaving her to manage on her own. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it. At least alone, she could think without having to pretend enthusiasm for crop rotation or railway shares. Lady Scarlett. She turned to find George standing closer than propriety strictly allowed, his expression troubled and determined in equal measure. Your Grace. Her pulse spiked immediately. They hadn't been alone since that brief conversation at the Ashford ball. Did you need something? I need to apologize. His voice was tight, controlled, for making you uncomfortable, for watching you at these events, for, he stopped, jaw clenching, for making a situation that's already difficult even more complicated. You didn't. I did. George's hands clenched at his sides. I questioned Adrian's courtship of you in front of his mother. I made my disapproval evident, and I've been, he exhaled sharply, I've been watching you at every event. I know people have noticed, and that's not fair to you. He cut himself off. It doesn't matter what I feel. You've made your choice, and I need to respect that. Scarlett's chest tightened. What do you feel? The question escaped before she could stop it. George went very still. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The only sounds were distant laughter from the party and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I feel, he finally said, his voice low and rough, that Adrian is my oldest friend, and betraying that friendship would make me the worst kind of man. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything he wasn't saying. The hunger, the conflict, the desperate wish that circumstances were different. Why are doing this? Why do you care? Scarlett asked, almost panicking. George's jaw clenched, that muscle jumping beneath his skin. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, because Adrian is treating this like a business transaction, and you deserve better than that. We've had this conversation, Scarlett said, even as something in her chest ached at his words. My circumstances require practicality. Your circumstances require that you sacrifice yourself to a man who doesn't even see you as a person. George stepped closer, his voice dropping to something urgent and raw. Do you know what he said to me? In the club yesterday. He said you were bideable and undemanding, like you were a horse he was considering purchasing. The words hurt even though Scarlett had already known, on some level, that this was how Adrian viewed her. And what would you have me do? She asked, her voice sharper than intended. Turn down the only proposal I'm likely to receive. Condemn my father to debtor's prison and our tenants to ruin. For what? The chance that someone else might come along and see me as more than beatable. Yes? George's vehemence startled them both. He took a breath, visibly controlling himself. Yes, because settling for someone who treats you like an acquisition isn't better than being alone. It's just slower suffering. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. His eyes burned into hers. I understand that you're intelligent, that you see the world with clear eyes, that you have depths Adrian will never appreciate because he's not interested in anything beyond surface pleasantries. George's voice dropped lower. I understand that Adrian will never truly see you, and that's... He stopped himself. That's a waste. Scarlett couldn't breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, as though she were something precious being carelessly discarded. And what would you have me do? She repeated, softer now. Even if everything you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, what alternative exists? I can't simply refuse Adrian and hope for better. Better doesn't come for women like me. George's expression turned anguished. Women like you, what does that mean? Older, plain, poor, desperate. Each word hurt to say. Find the wallflower that everyone politely ignores until someone practical enough comes along. You're not plain. George's voice was fierce. You're not desperate, and anyone who looks at you and sees a wallflower is blind. Then what do you see? The question escaped before Scarlett could stop it. George looked at her with such intensity that her knees weakened. I see someone who thinks before she speaks, who observes the world with intelligence and wit, who has been overlooked by people too shallow to recognize value when they see it. He stopped himself, seeming to realize he'd already gone too far. I see someone who deserves better than Adrian Bloody Kingsley. He's your friend. I know. George's laugh was bitter, which makes this infinitely worse. I'm betraying 20 years of friendship by having this conversation, but I can't. He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I can't watch you marry him knowing what I know. What do you know? That he'll make you miserable. That he'll treat you with polite indifference for the rest of your life. That you'll spend decades being adequate and biteable, and slowly forgetting that you're capable of so much more. Scarlett felt tears prick her eyes. And what am I supposed to do with that information, Your Grace? Thank you for the warning and proceed anyway. Because that's what I'll have to do. I don't have choices, I have circumstances, and I'm doing the best I can with them. What if there was another choice? George's voice was barely above a whisper. There isn't. What if there was someone who saw you differently, who valued your intelligence and your wit, who wanted to know your thoughts instead of simply requiring your silence? Scarlett's heart stopped. Could he possibly be suggesting? Someone like you, she asked, her voice shaking. George went very still. They stood there in the shadows of the terrace, close enough that Scarlett could see the pulse beating in his throat, the way his chest rose and fell with barely controlled breath. I can't answer that, he finally said. Adrian is my oldest friend. Whatever I feel, whatever I might feel, acting on it would be the worst kind of betrayal. But you do feel something. It wasn't a question. George's eyes held hers, and in them she saw everything. The hunger, the conflict, the desperate wish that circumstances were different. Yes, he admitted hoarsely. God help me. Yes, I feel everything I have no right to feel. Scarlett's world tilted. George Brandon, the Duke, the man who could have anyone, felt something for her, wanted her, saw her, and it changed absolutely nothing. Then we're both trapped, she whispered. Because She stopped, unable to finish the confession, unable to say that in 3 weeks he'd made her feel more alive than Adrian had in months of dutiful courtship. Scarlett, her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse. You should go, she said, stepping back before she did something irreparably foolish. Someone will see. People will talk. I can't afford scandal on top of everything else. George looked like he wanted to argue, to close the distance between them, to say something that would change everything. Instead, he nodded, the movement sharp. You're right. Forgive me. He turned to leave, then hesitated, his shoulders rigid with tension. For what it's worth, you deserve someone who sees you, who values you. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Even if I have no right to be that person. Don't, she interrupted, her voice breaking. Please don't. It only makes this harder. George's expression crumpled for just a moment before he locked it down. He bowed formally, as though they'd had nothing more than a polite exchange about the weather. Lady Scarlett, forgive me for taking your time. Then he was gone, disappearing into the ballroom and leaving Scarlett alone with a heart that felt like it had been torn in two. The next 2 weeks were torture. George stopped attending social events. Adrian mentioned, with casual satisfaction, that his friend had decided to leave for his estate in Derbyshire. Something about urgent business with the tenants. Scarlett told herself it was for the best. That distance was necessary, that George removing himself from the situation was the honourable thing to do. But she missed him with an intensity that terrified her, missed the way he looked at her like she mattered, missed knowing that somewhere in a crowded ballroom someone actually saw her, missed the possibility, however impossible, that she could be more than adequate, more than biteable, more than a solution to someone else's problem. Adrian continued his dutiful courtship, apparently oblivious to Scarlett's growing unhappiness. He called twice a week, took her for drives in the park where he discussed agricultural improvements, and began making increasingly specific references to their engagement announcement. Mother thinks we should announce at the Wexford ball, he said one afternoon, as they sat in the Thompson drawing room under Aunt Agnes's watchful eye. End of the season, appropriately grand affair. We'll have the bands read shortly after, marry by autumn. Very efficient timeline. Efficient, not romantic, not happy, efficient. That sounds acceptable, Scarlett managed. Adrian looked pleased. Excellent. I'll have Mother begin making arrangements. We'll need to discuss settlements, of course. Your father and I have already begun negotiations, but there are details that require your attention. He was discussing their marriage the way someone might discuss purchasing a new horse. That night, Scarlett couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, thinking about the rest of her life stretching ahead in a series of polite, emotionless interactions with a man who saw her as a convenient acquisition. Was this really better than being poor? Was security worth the slow death of her spirit? She thought about George Brandon, about the way he'd looked at her on that terrace, his eyes burning with everything he couldn't say, about his words, "You deserve better than Adrian bloody Kingsley." Did she? For so long, Scarlett had accepted that she deserved very little, that her value was determined by her father's fortune or lack thereof, her age, her fading prospects. That accepting Adrian's practical proposal was the best she could hope for, but George had looked at her and seen something else, something more, and now that she knew what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, how was she supposed to go back to being invisible? The answer, she realized as dawn broke over London, was simple. She couldn't. The decision crystallized over the following week. Scarlett went through the motions of her courtship with Adrian, attended the requisite social events, smiled and nodded at appropriate moments. But inside, she was gathering courage. Courage to disappoint her father. Courage to face financial ruin. Courage to choose uncertainty over the slow suffocation of a loveless marriage. Courage to believe that she deserved better. The Wexford Ball, the event where Adrian planned to announce their engagement, was 3 days away when Scarlett finally made her decision. She would end the courtship, not because of George Brandon, though he'd shown her what she was missing. Not because she had any guarantee of a better offer, but because she'd finally understood something fundamental. Better to be poor and whole than wealthy and slowly dying inside. The question was how to tell Adrian without destroying his pride or her father's hopes. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 days before the ball, Adrian called on her with unusual tension in his manner, not quite angry, but definitely not pleased. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. His tone clipped. Aunt Agnes discreetly withdrew, and Adrian remained standing, too agitated to sit. He paced to the window, hands clasped behind his back, then turned to face her with an expression that was carefully controlled but edged with frustration. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice tight, "about our arrangement, about whether proceeding is wise." Scarlett's pulse quickened. "Adrian, let me finish." He held up a hand, his pale blue eyes cold. "I entered this courtship for practical reasons. You needed financial security. I needed a suitable wife. It was logical, efficient." He paused, his jaw clenching. "But I'm not blind, Scarlett, and I'm not a fool. I don't understand. Don't you?" Adrian's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Brandon left for Derbyshire 3 days ago, suddenly, urgently, claimed it was estate business. But I know him better than that. He ran." His eyes bored into hers. "Chaos, and I know why." Scarlett felt the blood drain from her face. "Adrian, nothing happened. I know nothing happened." He cut her off, his voice rising slightly before he controlled it. "If something had happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be dealing with a scandal and ruined reputations." He moved closer, his expression hard. "But I've watched you both for weeks now. The way you look at each other when you think no one's watching. The tension whenever he's in a room. His sudden departure right before our engagement announcement." He stopped directly in front of her, looking down with something between anger and resignation. "I'm many things, Scarlett, but I'm not interested in marrying a woman who's in love with my best friend. I'm not—" But the protest died on her lips, because he was right. "Don't lie to me. I've tolerated many things in this courtship. Your lack of enthusiasm, your barely concealed relief whenever I leave, your obvious preference for books over my company. I tolerated it because it was practical." His voice turned bitter. "But I will not tolerate being made a fool of. I never meant to." "I know you didn't." Adrian's shoulders sagged slightly, some of the anger draining. "And neither did Brandon, which is the only reason I'm not calling him out. You were both trying to be honorable, trying to do the right thing." He laughed without humor. "But honor doesn't stop feelings, does it?" Scarlett felt tears prick her eyes. "Adrian, I'm sorry. Truly, you didn't deserve this." "No, I didn't." He moved away, back to the window, staring out at the garden. "But I also didn't deserve to spend the rest of my life with someone who settled for me out of desperation." The words hurt, because they were true. "So," Adrian turned back, his expression carefully neutral now, "I'm ending this courtship. I'll tell society we discovered we weren't suited. Mutual decision, no scandal. You'll be free to—" He paused, something flickering across his face. Do whatever you choose. Thank you, Scarlett whispered. Don't thank me. His voice was cold again. I'm not doing this out of generosity. I'm doing it because I refuse to be second choice, because I value my pride more than a convenient arrangement. He moved toward the door, then paused. And because Brandon is my oldest friend, and despite everything, I don't want to hate him for the rest of my life. Adrian, he's at Brandon Hall in Derbyshire, Adrian said without looking at her. 3 days' journey. He paused at the door, in case you were wondering. Then he was gone, leaving Scarlett alone with her heart pounding and a choice she never thought she'd have. The decision was made before Scarlett had time to second-guess it. Adrian had been gone less than an hour when she found herself in her father's study, heart pounding, hands trembling slightly as she faced the man whose desperation had driven her into this impossible situation. "Father, I need to speak with you." Viscount Thompson looked up from his ledgers with the weary expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news for so long that its arrival was almost a relief. "The courtship is over, isn't it?" He set down his pen with careful precision. "Lord Adrian has withdrawn." "He has." Scarlett's voice was steadier than she felt. "But father, it wasn't—" He ended it because— how could she explain? "Because I wasn't suited to him. We discovered we weren't compatible." Her father studied her for a long moment, those tired eyes seeing more than she wanted them to. "And the Duke of Brandon, does he factor into this incompatibility?" Scarlett's breath caught. I'm not blind, Scarlett. Neither is half of London society, apparently. The servants talk. Aunt Agnes talks. Even old Lord Pemberton mentioned something at his club about Brandon watching you like a hawk watches its prey. He leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 58 years. "Is there an understanding between you and the Duke?" "No." The word was honest, if painful. "There's nothing formal. There's barely anything at all. Just—" She stopped, struggling for words. "Just the possibility of something. If I'm brave enough to pursue it." "Pursue it?" Her father's eyebrows rose. "Scarlett, a lady doesn't pursue a gentleman. It's not how it's done." "I know." She moved closer to his desk, her hands gripping the back of a chair. "But father, if I don't go to him now, I'll lose whatever chance I might have. He left London because he thought I was marrying Adrian. He doesn't know the courtship is over. And I—" Her voice cracked. I can't let him think I chose Adrian over him when that's not true. When it was never true." Her father was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, his lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "Your mother did something similar once. Did I ever tell you that?" Scarlett blinked. "What?" "When we were courting. There was a misunderstanding. My fault entirely, and she thought I'd decided to court the Ashford girl instead. So she showed up at my estate in Kenthouse uninvited, with only her elderly aunt as chaperone, and informed me in no uncertain terms that I was making a terrible mistake." His eyes grew distant with memory. "It was the most magnificently improper thing I'd ever witnessed. I married her 3 months later." "Father, we'll be ruined, of course." He returned his attention to her, his expression serious but not unkind. "Say if you go to Derbyshire and Brandon doesn't marry you, your reputation will be destroyed. No respectable man will have you after that." "I know. And if he does marry you, society will whisper about how you entrapped him, how you threw yourself at a duke out of desperation." "I know that too. And you're willing to risk it anyway." Scarlett thought about George's eyes when he looked at her, about the way he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. About his words, "You deserve someone who sees you, who values you." "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm willing to risk it." Her father studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you'll need Aunt Agnes as chaperone, and you'll need to leave immediately. 3 days a journey means you can't waste time on propriety." He stood, moving to his desk drawer and withdrawing a small leather purse. "Take this. It's not much, but it should cover the posting-ins and any emergencies." Scarlett felt tears prick her eyes. "You're not angry." "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but I'm also proud. You're choosing to fight for what you want, rather than settling for what's convenient." He came around the desk and pulled her into an embrace. "That takes more courage than I had at your age, more courage than I've had recently, if I'm honest. What about the estate? The debts? We'll manage." His voice was gruff against her hair. "I should have said that weeks ago instead of pushing you toward Adrian Kingsley. We'll sell the London house if we must. Downsize. Find another way." He pulled back, gripping her shoulders. "But I won't sacrifice my daughter's happiness to maintain appearances. Your mother would never forgive me." 2 hours later, Scarlett found herself in a travelling coach with Aunt Agnes. 2 hastily packed trunks, and a heart that wouldn't stop racing. "This is mad," Agnes said cheerfully, as London's outskirts gave way to countryside. "Absolutely, wonderfully mad. I haven't had this much excitement in years. You're not going to lecture me about propriety. Darling, I spent 20 years in a marriage of duty to a man who saw me as decorative furniture. If you have a chance at something real, something passionate, I'll be damned if I let propriety stand in your way." Agnes patted her hand. "Besides, your mother did the same thing, you know. I was her chaperone then too. It's becoming rather a family tradition." Despite her nerves, Scarlett laughed. "Father mentioned that. I never knew. Your parents were mad about each other, quite disgracefully so, even after 20 years of marriage." Agnes's expression softened. "You deserve that kind of love, Scarlett, not Adrian Kingsley's efficient arrangement." The journey was long and uncomfortable. They stopped at posting inns to change horses, snatched brief rests in roadside establishments that ranged from respectable to questionable, and endured roads that seemed designed to test the limits of carriage suspension. Scarlett barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was too occupied with what she would say when she saw George. "I ended my courtship with Adrian. I came to tell you. I came because..." Because what? Because he'd looked at her like she mattered. Because he'd seen her when everyone else looked through her. Because in a handful of conversations, he'd made her feel more alive than she'd felt in 23 years. How did you explain that to a man who'd fled to Derbyshire specifically to avoid watching you marry his best friend? The first night, they stayed at a respectable inn in Hertfordshire. Scarlett lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of other travellers settling in for the night. Doubt crept in with the darkness. What if George had changed his mind? What if the intensity she'd seen in his eyes had been nothing more than temporary attraction, already fading in the 2 weeks since he'd left London? What if he was angry at her impropriety? A lady didn't chase after a gentleman, no matter the circumstances. What if Adrian had written to him, warned him, told him that Scarlett was desperate and grasping? "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You've come this far." But the doubts lingered. The second day's travel was harder. Rain began late in the morning, transforming the roads into muddy quagmires that slowed their progress considerably. The coach lurched and swayed, throwing Scarlett against the side hard enough to leave bruises. "So we could stop," Agnes suggested as thunder rumbled overhead. "Wait out the storm." "No." Scarlett's voice was firm despite the fear gnawing at her stomach. "We keep going." They pressed on through the downpour, reaching a small posting inn in Nottinghamshire as evening fell. The establishment was less refined than the previous night's accommodation. The rooms were cramped, the dinner mediocre, and the other guests loud and occasionally vulgar. Scarlett picked at her meal, unable to eat despite her hunger. "Second thoughts?" Agnes asked quietly. "Constantly." Scarlett set down her fork. "What if he doesn't feel the same way anymore? What if I've built this up in my mind into something it never was? What if I'm making a terrible mistake? Then you'll know." Agnes reached across the small table and squeezed her hand. "And knowing, even if the answer isn't what you hope, is better than spending the rest of your life wondering." "Is it?" Scarlett whispered. "At least now I have hope. If he rejects me, he won't." "You can't know that." "I can't," Agnes agreed. "But I saw the way that man looked at you, darling. I saw him barely holding himself together while Adrian discussed your courtship like a business merger. I saw him flee London rather than watch you marry someone else." She smiled gently. "A man doesn't run from something that doesn't matter to him." Scarlett wanted desperately to believe her. That night, the storm intensified. Thunder shook the inn's walls, and rain hammered against the windows with such force that Scarlett wondered if the glass might shatter. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the tempest, feeling as though the weather was reflecting her own internal chaos. What was she doing? She'd left London with barely any preparation, dragging Aunt Agnes on an improper journey to chase after a man who might not want her. She'd abandoned her father to deal with their creditors alone. She'd thrown away the last remnants of her reputation on the chance, the mere possibility, that George Brandon felt something real for her. It was madness. It was terrifying. It was the bravest thing she'd ever done. Somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, Scarlett made peace with her decision. Whatever happened at Brandon Hall, at least she would know. At least she would have tried. At least she could tell herself in the years to come that she'd had the courage to fight for what she wanted, instead of settling for what was safe. The third day dawned clear and bright. as though the storm had washed away all uncertainty. They made good time despite the muddy roads, and Scarlett found her nervousness transforming into something else: anticipation, determination, a fierce hope that refused to be suppressed. "Almost there," Agnes said as the landscape shifted from rolling fields to more dramatic terrain. "Derbyshire is beautiful, isn't it?" Scarlett barely heard her. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her heart beating so fast she felt lightheaded. Every mile brought her closer to George. Every turn of the wheels brought her closer to knowing whether she'd made the right choice or the worst mistake of her life. "Stop overthinking," Agnes advised, reading her expression with practiced ease. "When you see him, just tell him the truth. Men appreciate directness, even when they claim not to. What if he's changed his mind? What if distance has made him realize he doesn't actually—" Scarlett couldn't finish the sentence. "Then you'll know you tried, which is better than spending the rest of your life wondering, what if?" Agnes squeezed her hand. "But darling, I saw the way that man looked at you at the dinner party. He hasn't changed his mind. If anything, distance has probably made him more miserable." Scarlett wanted desperately to believe her. As they crested a hill and Brandon Hall came into view below, ancient stone and climbing roses, wild gardens and windows that caught the afternoon sun, Scarlett felt her breath catch. This was it. No turning back now. "Ready?" Agnes asked softly. Scarlett thought about George's eyes when he looked at her, about his words, "You deserve someone who sees you," about the way her heart had recognized something in him from that very first glance across the Ashford ballroom. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I'm ready." The coach began its descent toward Brandon Hall, toward whatever awaited her there, rejection or acceptance, heartbreak or happiness. Scarlett squared her shoulders and prepared to find out which. The estate was magnificent in a wild, untamed sort of way. Unlike the manicured perfection of London townhouses or the controlled elegance of estates like Adrian's, Brandon Hall seemed to grow organically from the Derbyshire landscape. Ancient stone walls covered in climbing roses, gardens that bloomed with cheerful disorder, and a house that sprawled across the hillside as though it had been there since the beginning of time. Scarlett's heart hammered as their coach rolled up the drive. "We should have sent word ahead," she said for the 100th time. "We should have—" "Nonsense. Surprise is better. Doesn't give him time to build up his defenses." Agnes smoothed her traveling dress with practiced efficiency. "Now, remember, you're a lady making a social call with proper chaperonage. Nothing scandalous about it." Yet, the coach stopped before the main entrance, and a footman appeared almost immediately, young, clearly surprised by unexpected visitors, but well trained enough to hide it. "Good afternoon," Agnes said, with the imperious confidence of a woman who'd faced down far more intimidating situations than an uncertain footman. "Lady Agnes Pemberton and Lady Scarlett Thompson to see His Grace the Duke of Brandon. Is he at home?" The footman's eyes widened slightly. "His Grace that is, I believe he's in the gardens, my lady. But, excellent. Perhaps you could inform him of our arrival. We'll wait in the drawing room. I assume he has one." "Of course, my lady, if you'll follow me." They were ushered into a surprisingly comfortable drawing room that bore none of the cold formality of the Kingsley townhouse. Books were stacked haphazardly on side tables, papers scattered across a desk in the corner, and the furniture looked lived in rather than merely decorative. Fresh flowers, clearly cut from the wild gardens rather than formally arranged, filled several vases. It was, Scarlett thought, exactly the sort of room George Brandon would have. "His Grace will be informed immediately," the footman said, then hesitated. "May I offer refreshment? The journey from London is considerable." "Tea would be lovely," Agnes said, "and perhaps something stronger for His Grace when he arrives. He may need it." The footman fled, clearly uncertain how to handle this situation. They waited and waited. Scarlett paced to the window, watching the gardens, trying to see if she could spot George among the roses and hedges. Her palms were sweating. Her heart wouldn't stop racing. What if he refused to see them? What if he was angry at the impropriety? What if— The door opened. Scarlett spun around, breath-catching. George Brandon stood in the doorway, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. He looked different than he had in London. More relaxed, somehow, despite the shock evident in his expression. He wore no jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, dirt smudged on his hands as though he'd been working in the gardens himself. His dark hair was thoroughly disheveled, and there was a scratch on his forearm from what looked like rose thorns. He looked real in a way he'd never quite looked in London's ballrooms. Scarlett. Her name came out rough, disbelieving. His eyes moved to Agnes, then back to Scarlett. Lady Agnes, this is unexpected. I imagine so, Agnes said dryly. Forgive the impropriety of arriving without notice, Your Grace. But my niece had something rather urgent to discuss with you, and letters seemed insufficient to the task. George's attention focused entirely on Scarlett, those green-gold eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. What happened? Is something wrong? Adrian ended our courtship, Scarlett interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. 2 days ago. He knew. He figured out. She took a breath, forcing herself to slow down. He knew I had feelings for you, that you had feelings for me, and he refused to marry someone who was in love with his best friend. The silence that followed was deafening. George stood frozen in the doorway, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like hope before he locked it down. I see, he said carefully. His voice controlled, in that way Scarlett had learned, meant he was barely holding himself together. And you came here to inform me of this development. I came here, Scarlett said, her voice shaking but determined, because you left London thinking I was going to marry Adrian, because you ran rather than watch me make what you believed was a terrible mistake, and because she took a step toward him, because you looked at me like I mattered, and I needed you to know that you mattered too. George's careful control cracked. Scarlett, you shouldn't be here. If anyone discovers you came to Derbyshire, I don't care. The words came out fierce. I'm tired of caring what society thinks, tired of being practical and sensible and accepting whatever scraps of happiness I'm offered. She took another step closer. You told me I deserved better than Adrian. You were right. But I also deserve better than spending my life wondering, what if... Lady Agnes is here as chaperone, George said, though his eyes never left Scarlett's face. That's something, at least. Your reputation. My reputation will be ruined if you don't marry me, Scarlett interrupted. I know that. I knew it before I got in the coach. I came anyway. George's breath caught. You came anyway, he repeated slowly, as though testing the words. You came to Derbyshire, risking scandal and social ruin to tell me that Adrian ended your courtship. I came to tell you that I'm free. Scarlett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and that, if you still feel what you said you felt, then I'm here, I'm choosing you if you'll have me. For a long, terrible moment, George didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then, in 2 long strides, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce, desperate, almost painful in its intensity. George held her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip, his face buried in her hair, his whole body trembling. You're here, he said hoarsely against her hair. You're actually here. This isn't... I'm not imagining this. I'm here, Scarlett confirmed, her own voice breaking. Her arms wrapped around him, feeling the solid reality of him, the warmth and strength and barely controlled emotion. I'm here, and I'm not leaving unless you tell me to go. Never. George pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with achingly gentle reverence. God, Scarlett, I thought, these past weeks I've been trying to convince myself that you'd be happy with Adrian, that I was being selfish wanting you when you'd made your choice, that the honorable thing was to stay away and let you live your life. And how is that working for you? Scarlett asked, her hands coming up to cover his. Terribly. His laugh was half sob. I've been making my head gardener's life a misery, working myself into exhaustion every day, trying not to think about you marrying him, trying not to imagine your wedding, trying not to... He stopped, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I was failing. Spectacularly. Good, Scarlett said fiercely. I'm glad you were miserable. I was miserable too. Every time Adrian discussed our engagement, I wanted to run. Every time I thought about spending my life with him, I felt like I was suffocating. She leaned into George's touch, and then he looked at me and said he wouldn't marry someone in love with his best friend. And I realized, I am in love with you. Completely. Impossibly. Even though we've barely had a dozen conversations and I don't know your favorite color, or whether you prefer coffee or tea or... George kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative or proper. It was weeks of suppressed longing unleashed all at once. Desperate and hungry and absolutely inappropriate for a drawing room with a chaperone present. Scarlett didn't care. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt. Years of being overlooked and undervalued pouring into this one perfect moment of being utterly, completely seen. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, Scarlett became dimly aware of Aunt Agnes clearing her throat pointedly. "I believe," Agnes said with exaggerated patience, "that this would be an excellent time for His Grace to propose, properly. Before I'm forced to pretend I didn't just witness that thoroughly scandalous display." George laughed, a real laugh, bright and unrestrained, and slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee while still holding Scarlett's hand. "Lady Scarlett Thompson," he said, his voice rough with emotion but his eyes bright with joy. "I don't have a ring prepared. I don't have a romantic speech ready. What I have is 3 weeks of suppressed feelings, a desperate hope that you meant what you just said, and the absolute certainty that I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." He paused, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "I see you, Scarlett. Your intelligence, your wit, your strength, your doubts and fears, and the fierce courage you showed by coming here. I see all of it, and I want all of it. I want to spend my days learning everything there is to know about you. I want to argue with you about books, and listen to you play piano, and watch you slowly take over my household with your quiet competence." His voice dropped lower. "I want to make you happy, to give you the life you deserve, to be the man who values you the way you should have been valued all along." Scarlett's vision blurred with tears. "So," George continued, his grip on her hand tightening, "will you marry me? Not out of desperation or practicality or duty, but because you want to, because you choose me the way I choose you." "Yes." The word came out choked with emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." George stood, pulling her back into his arms and kissing her again, softer this time, but no less intense. When he pulled back, he was grinning like a madman. "You're sure? Because there's no taking it back now. You came to Derbyshire unchaperoned." "Barely chaperoned," Agnes corrected. "Barely chaperoned," George amended. "And if you don't marry me now, you'll be ruined. So you're rather stuck with me, I'm afraid." "Good," Scarlett said, laughing through her tears. "I'm tired of being practical. Being stuck with you sounds perfect." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on George's estate, with Scarlett's father, Aunt Agnes, and a handful of local gentry as witnesses. Adrian had sent a letter, stiff and formal but not unkind, wishing them well. The Countess of Kingsley had sent nothing, which was probably for the best. London society, predictably, had a field day with the scandal. Did you hear? Lady Scarlett Thompson threw herself at the Duke of Brandon the moment Adrian Kingsley ended their courtship. Apparently she travelled to Derbyshire with barely any chaperonage. Quite desperate, really. The Duke had no choice but to marry her after such impropriety. Poor man, trapped by an ambitious wallflower. Scarlett heard the gossip when they returned to London a month later for the little season. She heard it, acknowledged it, and found she didn't care even a little bit. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them paint her as desperate and grasping. She knew the truth. She'd fought for what she wanted, and won. And every time George looked at her, which was often, she saw reflected in his eyes everything that mattered. Love, partnership, recognition, home. A year and a half later, the Brandon Hall in summer was glorious. Scarlett sat in the garden, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other holding a letter from Beatrice that detailed the latest London scandals with gleeful malice. The roses George had planted when they first married bloomed in cheerful profusion around her, and somewhere in the house she could hear her husband arguing good-naturedly with their new steward about crop rotation. "Still defending your unconventional agricultural theories?" Scarlett called, as George emerged from the house, shirt sleeves rolled up, hair thoroughly dishevelled in that way she'd come to love. "Defending science against superstition," George corrected, dropping onto the bench beside her and pulling her into his side with the easy affection that had become second nature. His hand found her belly automatically, feeling for the flutter of movement that had begun just last week. "How are you both?" "Your daughter is practicing her acrobatics," Scarlett said. "I think she's going to be as restless as her father." "Son," George corrected with a grin, "and he'll be calm and scholarly like his mother." It was an argument they'd been having for months now, neither particularly invested in being right, both simply enjoying the debate. "Beatrice writes that Adrian is courting Lady Caroline Ashford," Scarlett said, passing him the letter. "Apparently she's as practical as he is. They'll probably suit perfectly." "Good for him." George's voice was genuine. "He deserves happiness. even if he goes about finding it in the most businesslike way possible. You're not angry with him anymore. I was never truly angry. Frustrated, perhaps. Grateful, definitely. George pressed a kiss to her temple. If he'd been a better man, or if you'd been a different woman, I might have lost you to practicality. I was never going to choose practicality, Scarlett said softly. Not after you showed me what it felt like to be chosen for myself. George's arms tightened around her. Best decision I ever made, running away to Derbyshire. Best decision I ever made, chasing after you. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun painted the gardens gold. Somewhere in the distance, a footman was arranging furniture for the dinner party they were hosting that evening. Nothing grand, just local friends and neighbors who'd welcomed Scarlett with surprising warmth. Do you ever regret it? George asked quietly. The scandal, the gossip, the way London society still whispers about the wallflower who entrapped the Duke. Scarlett thought about the past 18 months, about learning every corner of Brandon Hall, about late-night conversations with George that ranged from philosophy to nonsense, about discovering that being seen, truly seen, was worth every whispered rumor. Never, she said firmly, turning to kiss him properly. Not for a single moment. Good. George's hand moved to her belly again, his expression softening. Because you're rather stuck with me now, for better or worse, probably worse, given my temperament. I'll manage, Scarlett said dryly. I've had practice dealing with difficult men. Adrian, I was thinking of you, actually. You've been terrorizing the gardeners again. George laughed, that bright, unrestrained sound that never failed to make Scarlett's heart lift. They'll survive. Everyone here does, eventually. You've made the household entirely too comfortable. Someone had to civilize this place. And civilizing me as well, I suppose. That's an ongoing project, Scarlett admitted, but I'm nothing if not determined. George pulled her closer, his expression turning serious. I love you. I don't say it often enough, but I do. Desperately, completely, in ways I didn't know were possible before you appeared in my life and turned everything upside down. I love you too, Scarlett whispered against his lips. Even when you're difficult, especially when you're difficult, perhaps. They kissed again, slow and sweet and full of promise. From the house, Aunt Agnes's voice drifted across the garden. If you two are quite finished being disgustingly romantic, we have guests arriving in 3 hours and Scarlett needs to dress. Scarlett pulled back with a laugh. Duty calls. Duty can wait 5 more minutes, George said, not releasing her. I'm not finished being disgustingly romantic yet. And there, in the golden afternoon sun, surrounded by wild roses and the promise of the life they'd built together, Scarlett decided that practicality could wait. Happiness, real, complicated, hard-won happiness, was far more important. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and writing a comment below. Your support means everything to us and keeps us inspired to tell more stories filled with love, resilience, redemption, and second chances. At the end of this video, you'll find another unforgettable romance from our collection. Click and discover where the next story will take you. With all our appreciation, the Empire of Heart Stories team